Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Daniel Greenstein, the Chancellor of Pennsylvania's State System of Higher Education. Dr. Greenstein became PASHE's Chancellor on September 4, 2018, and in that role, he serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the state system, which operates Pennsylvania's 14 public universities, serving nearly 100,000 degree-seeking students and thousands more enrolled in certificate and other career development programs. Prior to PASHE, Dr. Greenstein previously led the post-secondary success strategy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he worked on initiatives designed to raise educational attainment levels and promote economic mobility. He also served as Vice Provost for Academic Planning and Programs for the University of California System. As you know, Dr. Greenstein and PASHE have been in the news a lot lately as they are in the process of an integration process which is combining 6 of its institutions into 2. And he joins us today to talk about the integration, how it's going, and what are the keys for presidents who are considering doing a large merger or an acquisition. Dan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Really looking forward to our conversation. Now, you're there at PASHE, and you guys have been in the news just a little bit lately.
Yeah, well, we're trying to keep our head down, but people are still finding out about what's going on. So I guess that's a good thing. Maybe we can help the field learn a little bit one way or the other.
Well, I'm sure you will be. And, all the learnings that you've had, PASHE, you're a pretty big group of folks. You've got 14 public universities, over 100,000 degree-seeking students?
Yeah, 14 universities. Actually, we're down to about 90,000, 89,000 headcount in degree-seeking students because of enrollment declines over the last several years. But had been at that size, had been at about 120,000.
Well, that's, obviously you're making some major changes there, consolidating or integrating, as you call it, 6 universities into 2, one in the East, one in the West. What were the drivers behind this?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania, public education in Pennsylvania is not unique. It's experiencing sort of structural changes, trends that are apparent pretty much everywhere else across the industry. Declining size of the high school leaving population puts pressure on enrollments. State divestment obviously puts pressure on universities to raise prices on students, and the combination helps to exacerbate sort of enrollment decline as prices go up. I think those challenges are common across the country. They're particularly acute here in Pennsylvania, where the state is 48th in terms of its investment in public higher education. And you could argue that the enrollments declines are somewhat a little steeper in this region, but also because we have, a large number of rural schools which are experiencing demographic changes more quickly than other regions. So all that comes together and conspires in a way that has driven our enrollments down about 27% now in the last 11 or 12 years. Of course, as schools get smaller, they're not able to, operate as broadly with the same breadth of programming as their students might want, not without sort of charging more in the way of tuition. And we just can't continue to raise tuition on the low and middle income students that we have historically served and that we continue to need to serve.
Well, that does answer one question I had of, have you seen any changes in demographics? And yes, you just said you're serving mostly middle and lower class in PASHE.
Historically, that's really where our sector of public higher education, most of our universities are teaching to the master's level. They're regional universities. We do have one research university in our midst, Indiana, but they tend to serve rural populations. And of course, rural America is changing, not just in terms of its demographics, but also in terms of the growing inequality in this country, impacting the extent to which the families that we have historically served and that we need to continue to serve are able to pay the price of higher education.
And that is a huge challenge for folks where the state investment, and it's not just Pennsylvania, it's multiple states, the investment has dropped from the state. And the only way that you can make ends meet is to raise tuition.
Correct. And that's and then obviously it puts greater pressure on students from low and middle income. And sort of the challenge that the state faces, of course, is that more, not fewer jobs require people in them with some form of higher education. I think it's 60% of jobs in Pennsylvania today require people in them with some higher education. And only about 50% of adults in the state have some higher education. So there's this gap, and it's growing. And the only way to meet that gap is to continue to do better by historically underserved, students, including the low and middle income students that we serve, rural students, underrepresented minority students, adults, frankly. Just a mathematical impossibility that we can grow to meet the state's workforce development needs on the back of affluent white families. So it's a significant challenge for the Commonwealth, not just for the students that we serve.
And of course, you have a number of very high-end private universities there in Pennsylvania that you compete against as well, to some degree.
Well, I don't think we're competing against the high-end universities. The universities of Pennsylvania and the Carnegie Mellons, of course, they're great institutions, and there's many, Bucknell, Franklin and Marshall, et cetera. And they serve an important part of the market. There are a lot of private institutions that are not at the high end. That we have a wealth of institutions in this Commonwealth, including some which are quasi-public, Penn State and Pitt and Temple and Lincoln, and 100 or so which are private, ranging in size and selectivity from a Penn to a much more open access institution. And then we have a dozen or so, 15 now, community colleges. So it's a very crowded landscape for higher education. And of course, that is also something that has an effect on all of us, frankly.
Absolutely. And so with this crowded landscape and with the investment that the state is putting in, you had institutions in PASHE which were not doing well financially, correct?
Well, the economics of higher education are pretty simple. Your revenues typically in the public sector are made up of state investment plus what you get from students in the form of student tuition fees, room and board. As state investment goes down, tuition fees, room and board goes up. But as that begins to drive your historic student body away, your revenues decline. And we were built out, at our maximum size. We were about 120,000 headcount, and we didn't shift very quickly to tighten our belt as our student numbers declined and as our revenues declined. We sort of stayed built out at a larger stage, and so got into a bit of trouble financially as a consequence.
And so with that, you're going through, you're doing the integration of 3 universities in the East, 3 in the West, to make 2 larger universities. Let's talk a little bit about the process that you're following to do that.
Yeah, so let me just be clear. So the reason we're doing integration isn't really financially driven. So when a university's revenues contract, there's a playbook. You have to contract, like any family in the country. You balance your budget. You try to spend what you earn, and that's what we're doing here, obviously. And of course, as a consequence, in universities which have lost 50%, 40 to 50% of their enrollments, they begin to contract their programs, and it has a further downward pressure on enrollments. And the challenge with that, obviously, is twofold. One of them is that students really want breadth, right? Students want to be able to choose from a range of different programs and majors and minors and areas of concentration. But the other challenge that we face is that in rural America, the communities that we serve rely on our universities for their leadership, for their business leaders and their healthcare professionals and their teachers. Their main street, rural America, runs on the regional universities. And so as our universities contract in terms of the programs that they can offer, is also a challenge to their communities who don't just need one flavor of nurse with a particular specialty. They need all flavors of nurses, or they need all sort of range of business professionals, et cetera. And so as we contract our programs, we're not only not able to serve our students as well, but the communities that rely on them. So integration is a way of recognizing that, our universities are getting smaller. They're going to have to compress their program breadth if they operated alone. But if they work together, a university that once was maybe 3,000 students and can maintain, 25 or 30 different program areas can now be part of an entity which is 13,000 students, and the students and the communities around them can have access to 80 to 100 programs. So now you've got breadth of opportunity for students and the communities they serve, but in a way which is more financially sustainable. So that's the driver of integration. To the process, it's taken a while. The board did not have the legal authority to change the structure of the system. So we had to go to the legislature and seek that authority. So that took about a year through a legislative process. A bill was passed in June of 2020, which provided the board with Act 50, which provided the board with that authority. And then we went through a planning process, which was the process for integration was very tightly defined in Act 50. And it included a planning process, which we went through, obviously, presenting plans to the board. And then those plans, once presented to the board, were subject to a 60-day public review and comment period, which was conducted in a variety of different ways. And then, of course, the board had the opportunity to vote last July, approve the plans, and we're now sort of moving forward since July with the implementation of the integrations.
One of the things, and thank you for that overview of the process, one of the things that impressed me when we spoke last week was the transparency that you've used every step of the way. That's really unusual for something this big. Being a public entity, I'm sure it's required, but I think you went above and beyond, which was really nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it is actually required in Act 50, the degree of transparency. But we did go above and beyond. I mean, it's the right thing to do. I mean, we are the people's universities. We are the only public higher education in the state is in the state system's universities. And that level of transparency is essential. It's a public good. Obviously, we were involved in the legislative process that gave birth to Act 50. It was really that transparency was really done at our insistence. It's important for the people to know how their taxpayer dollars are being spent and why and with what outcomes. So it's sort of part of our culture, I guess, and values as a system. And obviously, we sort of poured that into the integration process.
So what were some of the things that you did, specifics to make sure that there was good transparency and stakeholders had input?
Oh, gosh. The planning process happened in a couple of phases. The second phase, which was the sort of the broadest and in some ways the most active. The first phase was a financial assessment. It was like a paper exercise. Hey, what happens if you would do this? What would it look like? And that, there was transparency with respect to the outcome. But the process, which was there to design what an integrated entity would look like and to really go through sort of developing a kind of blueprint, at least at the concept level, was incredibly inclusive. Dozens of working groups with, I think at one point, up to 1,000 people across the 6 universities contributing, students, faculty, staff, et cetera. We had public board meetings to consider the plans every couple of months, with updates. We had legislative testimony. I think I have the pleasure of testifying, I think, twice quarterly. And of course, every time you testify, you do in advance, a handful of briefings to legislators. And we did briefings of community members. We engaged students. We did surveys. It was pretty intensive. So there was a lot of input. And then obviously the public review and comment period was, then the plans were available. And then, you open it up. Of course, it was during COVID. So it was all done, virtually via Zoom. But I think we had something, I forget. We had a lot, 4 times, maybe 8, at least 8 hours of testimony. And it was really it was listening as the board members and myself, obviously listening to people come forward. So there was an awful lot of visibility into the work, and it was a good process. I mean, it was rough and tumble as political processes are, but as a result of the review and comment period in particular, we made some pretty substantive changes to the plan, which I think on the whole were on the whole very beneficial to the plan that was ultimately produced.
What were some of those changes that you got from the stakeholders in those listening sessions?
So I think, a couple of them, I think for me were, we prolonged the process of curriculum blending. I'm going to put it that way. So imagine you have 3 universities that come together into a single integrated entity accredited as a single institution. You bring 3 individually accredited curricula together. And so what does that timeline look like? And that timeline, we were initially planning on doing, I think, in a year. We extended it to 3, sort of in a phased approach, which I think was the right thing to do. It had all sorts of other implications for our technology build and, the sort of systems environment that you have to put around your curriculum delivery. So I think that was an important thing to do. We did some additional market research into the interest, not just of students, but of their parents in the availability of online forms of educational delivery as a means of broadening access to a greater range of programs, so asking people, not as PASHI, but, in a survey that was anonymous, if you had an opportunity to extend the number of majors and degrees that you might take, and that sort of involved taking up to 25% of your courses online, how would you feel about that? And asking parents and their students. So, one of the essential components of the integration, testing that in the market, which I thought was a good thing to do. We made some changes to the governance structures that we were thinking about. We made a number of changes to the legislative process that we were using to move forward. A handful of things. I think we did an economic impact study. We didn't do because we kind of knew what the result was and we were going to change. We didn't want to spend the money, but people urged us to do an economic impact study. It was in the act. We did it. We got the result we anticipated, but it's nice to have the data. So there were a variety of things like that.
It sounds like, again, you looked at many different things. Did you look at what future demand was going to be when looking at the programs, or did you leave this more to the individual institutions and faculty?
Well, so the demand analysis was really we were looking at the sort of fundamental characteristics of the institution that we were designing and asking, was there demand for that? Demand analysis to do at a detail level is something that we're doing now. It's very tricky, as you can imagine, in a very competitive environment. It's largely to do with price, frankly. And our biggest challenge and this is true again across higher education, is that, for institutions like ours, which, are essentially focused and have been for over 125 years on sort of middle and low income America and rural America, if our price is not differentiated significantly from that of other more expensive offerings, the value proposition is very difficult to sustain. And what's challenging is that the students that we serve, it's not that they're going to go other places. They don't go. And the challenging part of that for the state is twofold. One of them is that it denies itself the workforce it needs to basically stay strong. And Pennsylvania is suffering as a consequence. I think we're 42nd in the nation in terms of unemployment. We used to be 24th. There's a direct parallel between that unemployment rate and the fact that we don't have an adequately educated workforce. And of course, by taking away those affordable pathways from the low and middle income students who need them, it just exacerbates the workforce problem. But the other, it's a societal question. What kind of state do you want to live in? What kind of society do you want to belong to? Are you okay being in a place where, low and middle income families are basically denied all of the affordances that are available to someone who goes to college? And it's not just that you can earn more. I mean, it is demonstrably proven that going to college is, probably the most reliable pathway into and beyond the middle class today. It tracks to things like health outcomes and, family stability and civic contribution, et cetera. Are we okay just saying, hey, 30, 40, 50% of the population, forget about it. You can't afford it and we don't care. And to me, that's not right. And that has been the value of public education all along. And so, the question, I think, is ultimately a policy question. It's not a PASHE operational question. It's a policy question for our elected representatives to really ask themselves those kinds of issues are going to have to be addressed, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country.
Well, that was the whole point of the whole California experiment with education, was to reach down, education being a public good. And when we go through cutting taxes as much as we have, when we go through recessions, et cetera, education takes a hit. And frankly, I don't know if it's ever going to get back to where it was, but that's obviously a question for another day.
Yeah.
And obviously something that neither one of us are going to be able to solve by ourselves.
No, that's true.
So back to PASHE, we talked a little bit about leaving the implementation up to the regions. You've gone through the process. It's been down to the regions now, and they're working on it. Do I have that correct?
Well, so I think the process has changed to reflect the particular work of the time. So there have been really three broad phases. The first phase was 3 months long. It was a paper exercise. It was like an analytical financial exercise. Mm-hmm. On paper, show us a couple of different trajectories, institutions that don't integrate, institutions that do integrate. What's the bottom line? The second was, okay, go plan an integrated entity. And that took place from October to July 2021, and then implementation. So there's two, that first component, financial exercise, was tightly held. I mean, it is a deeply analytical exercise. You get a bunch of smart people together who've done that kind of analytics, and you do the work. You get input obviously from the universities, but all the data, it's all driven by sort of analytical data that, financial data. The second part was broadly consultative. And obviously, because it was driven by a political process, it closely involved the Office of the Chancellor. As we move into implementation, okay, go build it. Obviously, we're staying in touch with the Office of the Chancellor. I'm not going to turn my back and go away. But yeah, the responsibility really falls heavily on the two presidents, one who's acting as president of each of the three institutions in each of the region, their leadership team, and then the consultative processes that they have put in place. And we obviously check in from time to time. And of course, I still get to testify every quarter.
Oh, joy.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, well, at least it's not in the U.S. Congress. I would hope that it's a little nicer, but maybe not. I don't know.
I've been, I'm fortunate, I think, that the Pennsylvania legislature generally, both chambers, obviously both caucuses, and I don't testify to the body of the whole. I tend to testify to the combined education and appropriations committees, are actually pretty, up on higher education. They're good. And, we've been on a journey together. It's not just been a one and done kind of thing. And as a consequence, people get more deeply involved and more familiar with the issues. So it's actually, in a perverse sort of way, it's kind of enjoyable because you have the opportunity to debate the kind of issues that we were just talking about. And what's kind of interesting to me is that, integration is really part of a broader fundamental redesign of the entire system, all 14, not just 6 of the universities. That redesign itself is driven by this sense that, this view that public higher education is a partnership. It is a partnership between the state and the institutions. It's the institution's responsibility to run effectively, to run efficiently, to provide the best possible outcomes for students that can be made available, to make sure that we're doing everything as currently as we can, as up to date as we can. And that every dollar, whether it's taxpayer or student, taxpayer makes up about 25% of what we spend, student about 75% of what we spend, that every cent of every dollar to the maximum possibility is spent in a way that advances our students' outcomes. That's our job. The state's job then is to support us effectively. We had fallen down on our part of the job in a variety of ways. And that was certainly the onus or the driver behind this broader system redesign. Integration is a part of that. Was that, okay, we're going to get our house in order. We're going to be responsive to the feedback we're getting, not just from the elected representatives, from many of our constituencies, our alumni, our staff, our faculty, our students, their parents. We're going to become more transparent. We're going to become more accountable. We're, I would like to think, the most transparent institution in the country today, with the vast amount of information available online through a variety of manipulable dashboards. We're going to get our arms around our costs, because our costs have gotten way out ahead of our revenues. And we have, so we're going to get our arms around the challenges faced by our smaller schools. So we've done all those things. It's not been easy. It's not always been fun. But that was our responsibility as a public institution. And so now we're going back to the state and saying, okay, remember this thing about partnership. Now we have to reestablish our funding relationship. We have done everything you have asked. So now we need to revisit the funding level and to return to that part of the conversation. We've just engaged in that way by asking for significant additional funding, not just for the university, but for the system. But for actually direct to student financial aid dollars that would begin to address the price imbalances.
That's really great to hear. And I'm guessing there's been some resistance to change what you're doing along the way, but it hasn't, because you've had such an open and transparent process. It hasn't thrown any major monkey wrenches in it. Am I correct?
Well, change is hard. And it's hard on,
really?
It's ultimately, it's very personal, and it involves real people having to do and think differently. And it's, you can't just say, folks, hey, be different or do stuff differently. You have to provide those supports. And you have to make room for, it's an emotional journey, where these institutions have been around for a long time in the structure that they're currently in. And so, I think one of our biggest challenges is to support that journey for everyone. People are the most important part of who we are and what we do. And obviously we want to bring them along because we care and we need them. And so I think, and it's not easy. And I'm not sure resistance is a funny word. It's an emotional thing.
Resistance to change usually comes in three different factions. It's the emotional, it's the structures, and it's the processes. Yeah. And until you can get the emotional or the mental models changed, none of the others, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily good to force change, although sometimes you have to. Now, you've had different challenges. Your challenges have evolved over time. I think one of the things you really hit on when we spoke last was you're concerned about staff burnout, especially the leadership burnout. You guys have been at this for a while now.
Yeah, I think intensively for, the legal team, the advocacy team, we've been at it for about 2.25 years. I think the campus folks more intensively for about 1.5 years. And yeah, it's obviously, you're building a whole new structure. You're not, it's funny when you integrate 3 universities, A plus B plus C does not equal A and B and C. You're building something completely new. So they're building something completely new while they're running 3 things, which are, as they were, and they're doing it all during a pandemic. So yeah, I am concerned. It's exhausting. It's a lot. It's constant. It's all new. So you never know any step forward where it's, you kind of think, where you're going, but you don't necessarily see, what the pushback is going to be or what the new challenges are going to be. And so you're constantly navigating, roiled waters. I mean, it's uncharted territory. I mean, to coin a phrase. And so, yeah, I think it's tiring. We're trying to pace the work in a way that's sort of sensitive to people's needs. I mean, the worst thing is that when all of the planes land on the runway at the same time, we're trying to avoid that. But it's tough, and that concerns me a great deal.
Well, you told me that, your accreditation has really been helpful in this process. You work with Middle States.
Yeah, Middle States has been a great partner. All of those who have a kind of regulatory role, and, Middle States, obviously, I think in some ways the biggest, the leader of the pack, as it were, have been very helpful. I mean, we went out of our way to make sure that we were bringing people on board early, very early, so no one's surprised. And even as we were just sort of twinkle in our eye kind of thing, if an idea, begin to let people know we're headed down this path, and what does it mean for you, and what are the processes that we're going to need to follow, and they've been helpful, as you'd expect. I mean, they're a membership organization. Their job, like our job, is to advance students' needs, students' interests, and all of us want to do what's right for our students. And, they're in effect a creation of the universities that are members of them. So that's not a surprise. And they've sort of been true to that every step of the way. So I appreciate the collegiality, not just from Middle States, but from the NCAA, from the U.S. Department of Education, FSA, from our own Pennsylvania Department of Education. And there are any number of other accreditors who, we'll need to have conversations with, but it's been, or regulators. So it's been, we obviously need to keep on top of it, more us informing them and making sure we're following their rules and processes. But no, I've been very, very pleased by the partnership and the help, frankly.
That's incredible to hear. And I think because most regulators, most accreditors at this point are getting much more used to merger activity. It's not like yours is a very complex one, but it's not like they haven't done it before. And so they're a little bit more open. They're a little bit more understanding. And at the same time, they know certain things they have to do. Yeah,
I mean, I have to say it was a great relief. I mean, if any of my Middle States colleagues are listening, I would say this to them personally. It was months and months and months ago, probably over 1 year ago, and we all got together for the first time on the phone. And we're talking about, well, how do you do this? And you say, oh, yeah, we've seen here's N number of garden varieties of what you're trying to accomplish. And we have a process for each of them. And and I'm like, oh, thank. And actually the people on the phone, we were kind of relieved in a way, because when you've never sort of even contemplated this stuff, you're like, oh my God, there's a wilderness out there. And speaking to people who have actually been through the wilderness and they sort of laid some road, they put some inns along the way with some, coffee shops. It's all of a sudden, it doesn't seem so horrifying. So it's helpful.
That's really good. Now you're starting to get to the point where you can start looking for some results. What are the things that you're really your benchmarks as far as this, you're going to be successful?
Well, it's a whole bunch of things. I mean, I am looking forward to the various review, the regulatory review, middle stage review. I think that'll be incredibly helpful. Any regulator will review an institution. Our accreditor has 8 standards, and they'll review us against those 8 standards. And that feedback will be really important. We'll have similar kind of dialogue with others, NCAA, et cetera. So I think getting that third party perspective is going to be really helpful. Because it's third-party perspective, it's easy to, the work is so consuming, it's so intense, it's such high stakes, it is easy to get tunnel vision. So I think that sort of back and forth is going to be helpful. And we'll see some of that will begin to happen this spring. Obviously, the plan is to enroll our first cohort of students into the integrated entity. Again, obviously requires accrediting approval, et cetera. But in fall of 2022. So, opening day is, are people going to be able to sort of get financial aid packaging, and, are all the systems going to work, and can students log on and find their classes, So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in fall 2022, which will be a good indicator of our ability not just to build processes that work across 3 institutions, but to communicate effectively with all of the stakeholders, students, but not only students, their parents, our faculty and staff, so that process of enrolling and registering and getting started, in the new entity is as friction-free as possible. That's going to be certainly a huge early indicator. And then longer term, it's the usual kinds of indicators that any institution would look at, which have to do with enrollments and student outcomes and expected family contribution. Can we offer affordable quality education that works for the communities that we serve? That shows up in a small handful of indicators, which we watch very closely for all of our universities. Actually, not just closely, but very publicly. If you go on to our website, you can find all of our data on inputs as well as outcomes in dashboards that are available for people to review. So we look at that very closely, and we'll continue to look at that for our integrated entities as well as for our other institutions.
Well, I would offer a hearty congratulations for everything that you guys have done so far. I mean, you're driving down the road at 80 miles an hour and changing all the spark plugs at the same time.
Yeah, maybe 1 or 2 tires as well.
Well, and you're able to keep everything between the white lines. And so congratulations on that. I wish we had more time. We're coming up to the end. So Dan, if you would, 3 takeaways for fellow presidents and board members on what you've been going through and how they can survive it or thrive through it.
Yeah, so thrive is hard. I mean, look, I think for board in particular, I think it takes a lot of courage. The decisions we needed to take along the way have not been easy, especially in a public institution where things are so inevitably political, small p political, and very public in systems and institutions which are beloved and ought to be broadly by the people. You're going to encounter a great deal of resistance, and it's easy to not to turn away from doing the right thing just because of that. So I think courage is one thing. I think all of this has to be analytically driven. There is so much emotion tied up in this kind of effort, and there's so often people will just turn to their opinion about this is what we've always done, or this is what we really need to do, and we try to ground every single sort of hypothesis about where we might go in data. So bring the data, not because the data won't answer the question, but the data will inform the discussion, which results in an answer. And it's really more important to me and to my board, and I'm really a reflection of the board, when you're having a conversation of, should we look at X or Y? The question is one the right way to go versus the other. It's where are you currently, and what does the data suggest will happen if you go? So bring the data and use them in decision making, however comfortable the decisions they are. And then the other, I think, at a personal level, resilience. It requires a huge amount of resilience, because you don't take something like this on without getting shot up pretty significantly. How do you become resilient without being cynical? I think is a challenge that folks tend to face. For me, it's just about having a North Star, which has to do with sort of fairness, this sort of passionate view that at least the society that I want to live in is one where, everybody does have a fair chance of traveling along the most reliable pathway and bringing their families along with them into a sustainable kind of career. And if that requires, and it does, our institutions to be responsive to the needs of our elected representatives, as well as our alumni and our students and their parents. And it requires us being responsive to make hard choices that the benefit, which is the mobility we're offering all of the Commonwealth residents who otherwise wouldn't have it, is worth, sort of making your way through the challenges.
Absolutely. And we keeping in mind, it's all about the citizens. It's all about the students, giving them what they need so that they can live productive, fulfilled lives.
Yeah.
That's it.
Pretty simple.
And of course, I'm sure your hair is not any more gray than it was when you started.
I may be 2 inches shorter, but I can neither confirm nor deny.
I understand it. It depends on which side of the aisle you're on. Anyway, right. What's next for you? What's next for PASHI, Dan?
Well, so we're obviously deeply engaged in this conversation with the legislature now. I mean, 2 things, obviously implement the integration. That's part of a broader redesign, which is also going forward. So we're, in a large implementation phase. So, so overseeing that as a CEO, and then sort of progressing a conversation with the General Assembly, our owners, and the administration about, what should it's really, again, dig back to that policy question, now that you have a public state-owned university system, which is well and effectively managed, what level of funding is appropriate for it, and now determine and trying to support a conversation which ties funding level to outcomes. And so it's really not a question about how much money, but is, what are we trying to accomplish? And for me, it's about, workforce development, social mobility, and putting the numbers under that, for this amount, you can see that kind of outcome. And supporting that conversation in the legislature, which, and is I'm sure going to be an important one with, I'm not sure, obviously, what the result is, an uncertain result, but that's a pretty primary focus of mine right now.
Well, very good. Well, I want to thank you very much for being willing to be on the show today. It's been a wonderful conversation, giving folks the background and what you're going through, some of the challenges. It's been real wonderful. I want to thank you, Dan. Love to have you back on 6 months, a year, just to, check up where you are.
Happy to do it.
Sounds good. Again, thank you, Dan.
I appreciate it, Drumm.
Thanks for listening. And a special thank you for this week's special guest, Dr. Dan Greenstein of PASHI, and for his sharing with us their process on how they are integrating 6 campuses into 2, and why higher education is so critical to people of Pennsylvania and throughout the U.S. Our next episode will be our traditional end-of-the-year look back with yours truly and Deb Maui. Be sure to turn in as we look back to the key events and see how we did with our prognostications, as well as taking a look forward into 2022 and what the big stories might be.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.